Hey, what's up guys? Chris Irvin, the ketologist, coming at you with a new video on a topic that I talk about all the time, which is insulin sensitivity. So what's going to be a little bit different about this video is I'm going to be explaining kind of a new concept, a new way to look at this topic to maybe help you guys better understand it and better, apply these principles to your dietary lifestyle, right? So before I jump into this new concept, I want to talk a little bit more about just like what insulin is, what its function is in the body, and then kind of get into this new concept on insulin sensitivity. So insulin, in its simplest terms, is a hormone that is produced by our pancreas. It's produced under a lot of different situations, but one of the most kind of prominent situations in which it's released is when we consume carbohydrates and we see an increase in our blood sugar. So we see an increase in our blood sugar that stimulates our pancreas to increase insulin production. And what insulin then does is it travels throughout our body and it communicates with our cells and tells our cells to open up their doors and allow this glucose to be taken in out of the bloodstream into the cell where it can then be used for energy. Now, one of the important things to know about this is that this is not a bad thing. This is not inherently a bad mechanism. It's something that is important for our survival. It's something that our bodies need to possess. The problem is that the standard American diet leads to the overstimulation of this process. So the standard American Western diet, in which we are consuming a lot of processed carbohydrates and consuming them very frequently, leads to this process being stimulated all of the time. And what happens when this process is overly stimulated is that we start to develop what is known as insulin resistance. Now, what insulin resistance is it's when our cells are no longer really able to effectively communicate with insulin to allow those doors to be open and glucose to get into our cells. So, insulin is in our bloodstream, it's knocking on the doors of the cells, it's trying to get in, but the cells are resistant to that action. So what happens is one, the cells don't end up getting the fuel that they need to carry out their functions, but then also our pancreas continues to secrete insulin because we still have elevated blood sugar. So this kind of just is a cycle that compounds the problem and further leads to this insulin resistance. So now, the reason why this is important is because insulin resistance is something that we see in some of the most common chronic diseases in the United States and across the entire world. So if you guys have read any of my work, you hear me talk about this all the time, but one of the two biggest contributors that we see contributing to chronic disease is insulin resistance and inflammation. So that's why this is so important. Now, the opposite of insulin resistance is insulin sensitivity. So insulin sensitivity means that your cells respond very well to the actions of insulin. It means that when we do consume some carbohydrates, we have a healthy insulin response in which our cells are able to actually take in and utilize those carbohydrates rather than leaving them in the bloodstream where they can be toxic to our body. So the goal is to be insulin sensitive, and the goal is not to be insulin resistant. So now the question is how do we, improve insulin sensitivity, or how do we maintain insulin sensitivity? And that's the concept that I'm going to talk to you guys about today. So up here I have, on this side, I have a little graphic popping up. And some of you guys, if you follow me on social media, you may have seen this graphic before. But this graphic is what I call the insulin sensitivity pressure gauge. And it's a concept that I've come up with just to kind of help explain what this process means. So as you can see in this graphic, you see that there is a chart. And you see that the pressure gauge is in the green, it's insulin sensitive, and in the red, it's insulin resistant. So we really want to make sure that we have that pressure gauge over it kind of on the decrease side of things, right? We don't want high pressure in our insulin sensitivity pressure gauge, right? We want it to be low. So here you see on this graph the list of things that increase our pressure, right? That push us more towards insulin resistance. So those are things like overeating carbs, overeating calories. Now note that these are chronic overconsumption of those things. So that's not just going to happen from a couple overfeedings. These are things that are going to happen from a long time of you overeating carbohydrates and overeating calories. Also, what's going to increase this pressure is going to be a sedentary lifestyle, pro-inflammatory foods, and poor sleep. So these are some things that are going to push you more towards being insulin resistant. It's going to increase that pressure, right? So we don't want that to happen. That's bad for our health. Now, on the other side of things, we have things that decrease our pressure, and these are things like carbohydrate restriction, calorie restriction, fasting, exercise, and then insulin sensitizing agents, which are supplements that can help stimulate better insulin responses. These are things like berberine, chromium. There's a few others out there that do that. So it's very important that we have a kind of healthy balance of these things, right? So one of the issues with our health today is that if we look at the things on this list that are increasing in pressure, these are the things that so many people are doing in their life all the time. So most of our population is overeating carbs, they're overeating calories, they're not exercising, they have a ton of pro-inflammatory processed foods in their diet, and they have poor sleep. So when you understand that, then you understand why insulin resistance, which is a precursor to diabetes, which is one of the most common diseases that we're faced with today, is such an issue in our population. Now, these things that decrease the pressure, things like carbohydrate restriction, calorie restriction, fasting, exercise, and these insulin sensitizing agents are not very common things that we do in our society. Now, these things are starting to become more popular, and they are starting to become more popular in the treatment of insulin resistance and different metabolic disorders, but it's still not something that everybody's following. So now you can kind of see why insulin resistance is something that so commonly occurs in our population. Now, one of the things that we need to look at is where do we go if we are at this end of the spectrum, right? So if we are insulin resistant, that pressure gauge is all the way over at red, we are unhealthy, we are metabolically inflexible, we don't use carbohydrates really well, what are the measures that need to be taken? Well, if you're falling all the way on the opposite end of that spectrum, then it is going to take more extreme measures to get you back to being insulin sensitive. So that is going to probably require you to be calorie restricted. It's going to require that carbohydrate restriction. That's probably going to have to be really strict. It may require you to incorporate some fasting. And then of course, exercise is going to be something that we should be doing anyways. Now, for people who maybe aren't on that extreme end, maybe you're just somebody who you have been eating carbs a little bit more lately, you haven't been feeling as well, you're starting to feel like your body isn't utilizing those things as well, then you might not have to take as extreme measures to lower that insulin sensitivity pressure gauge back towards being insulin sensitive, right? So maybe you just have to incorporate a little bit of fasting. Maybe it's just you kind of increasing your exercise intensity. Maybe it's you just doing kind of a cyclic approach to carbohydrate restriction. And the same can be said for when we're trying to maintain insulin sensitivity, right? So if we're trying to, we are insulin sensitive, we want to make sure that we're maintaining that insulin sensitivity, then we're going to want to make sure that we're incorporating these different strategies periodically into our diet. So we don't always have to be restricting carbs, we don't always have to be restricting calories or fasting and all of that stuff, but we want to make sure that we're doing it periodically so that we can help maintain this. So, this is kind of the concept of like different health levers that I like to talk about. So, there's different levers that we can pull on to give us different results when it comes to our health. All of these things on the list of decreasing pressure here are different levers that you can pull to help you reach your different health goals. And when it comes to, improving our metabolic health, our metabolic function, our mitochondrial function, our insulin sensitivity, these are all going to be very good strategies for doing so. So that's it for this video, guys. I hope that this is helpful. I hope that this is kind of a concept that can help you guys understand this a little bit more. Health doesn't have to be incredibly challenging. Sometimes it's just a matter of knowing what tools we have in our tool belt to allow us to reach our health goals. So I hope this is helpful for you guys. If you found this video helpful, please share it with a friend who could use hearing this message. All right, thanks a lot for watching today, guys.